Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm joined by Dr. Dan Linford and Phil Halper to respond to Dr. William Lane Craig's recent response to one of our videos. We recently made a video, I've linked it in the description, responding to Craig on the scientific case for the beginning of the universe. And recently, Craig made a response to our video. He posted it on his Reasonable Faith website. As of this current recording, it's only available in audio format, so we're just going to be listening to the audio and responding. Dr. Dan Linford is an instructor at Old Dominion University. I've linked to his amazing dissertation in the description, which is on the scientific case for the beginning of the universe, as well as on some of the philosophical case responding to that. Therein, I think Dan shows fairly convincingly that science should leave us agnostic about whether or not the universe began to exist. And Phil, of course, has his YouTube channel, Phil Halper, or Sky High Phil, and he has on lots of leading cosmologists. And he also has a book that's coming out, which is very exciting. So Phil, tell the audience a little bit about this exciting book.
Yeah, it's called The Battle of the Big Bang. It's published by University of Chicago Press. I've co-authored it with Nihaya Shafshodi, who's an award-winning cosmologist, and it's all about competing models for the Big Bang. And we've recently got like rave reviews from like Carla Rovelli, Sabine Hossenfelder, Sean Carroll, Roger Penrose, you name it. So we're very, very excited. That comes out on May 29th, but you can pre-order it on Amazon today.
Awesome, and I've linked that in the description. Okay, so without further ado, how about we get into William Lane Craig's response to our video.
Well, the Majesty of Reason podcast, hosted by Joe Schmidt, has responded to one of our recent podcasts on the Kalam cosmological argument. You've been a guest on that podcast. It's over 2 hours long, but let's pick out some of the excerpts of their key responses. And first, Bill, I'd like to remind our viewers that the evidence from the expansion of the universe is only one part of your case in support of the premise that the universe began to exist.
Yes, that's right, Kevin. We mustn't forget, for example, the scientific evidence based upon the thermodynamic properties of the universe, the generalized second law of thermodynamics and Wall's theorem. And then in addition to the scientific confirmation, we have the two philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past that I offer, and more recently, arguments by people like Rob Koons and Alex Proust for causal finitism. So the support for the second premise of the argument that the universe began to exist is very weighty.
We're going to hear Craig make a qualification in just a second. But Dan, I want you to at least say maybe something about the thermodynamic argument for the beginning of the universe. If you can take us through that, whether or not that's good evidence that the universe began to exist.
And this is a very old argument. In fact, predates Big Bang cosmology. It goes back to at least the 19th century, when people realized that there are various physical processes that have time asymmetry. So what does that mean, that it has time asymmetry? Well, there's various processes that happen only in one direction of time, but not in the other. So for instance, if you can crack an egg, break an egg into a frying pan, and the egg cooks, but you never have a process, you never see an egg uncook, hop back into the eggshell, and the shell heal itself, right? That doesn't happen. So that's a process we only see happen in one direction. What people realized in the 19th century was that all of these various different processes that have a time directedness to them, that happen only in one direction, maximize a quantity called the entropy, that we now call the entropy. It's a quantity that, as these systems evolve through time, increases. So in the 19th century, there were some theologians in Germany who thought that, well, if we have this quantity that increases in every time asymmetric process, what about the whole universe? Doesn't the whole universe have some entropy associated with it? And if so, can't we trace that entropy backwards and then conclude that the universe must have had a beginning? There's a book by Helga Krog that goes through that history called Entropic Creation. But even in the 19th century, what people like Eis and Kracke realized was that the fact that a quantity increases over time doesn't tell you that there must be some point at which that quantity began to increase, right? You can have a monotonic function defined over the entire real line, which is always increasing. So that's one possibility. Another possibility that physicists have explored is that you could have some kind of dynamical process that either for some subregion of the universe gives the appearance of having a reduction of the entropy, even though the overall entropy of the universe continues to increase. Or you can have physical processes by which the entropy actually does decrease from one period of the universe's history to another. And so there are live cosmological models that are beginningless models, and that are thermodynamically sensible. That is to say, they are models in which the entropy always increases. There are other models in which they propose some sort of mechanism for reducing the entropy. The other thing that can be said here is that when we talk about the universe's entropy, part of what we're talking about is the probability to find the universe in any particular state. What people have known for a long time, ever since Penrose did some calculations in, I think, the 1970s, is that if you just constrain the state of the universe to being one in which it allows for the existence of creatures like ourselves, then the physical state that you expect the universe to be in, that's most probable, is not the kind of state that we see in the universe today. So if you use a principle that says that the universe must allow for the existence of life, and that it's going to be the most probable universe that allows for the existence of life, then the universe you predict us to live in is not the universe that we actually find ourselves in. It's actually radically different from that. Now, what that means is that if you have some theological hypothesis according to which what motivates God is to create us, well, then what you predict from that hypothesis is not the universe that we find ourselves in. So unless theists want to give us something more about what God's motivations might be, the entropic features of the universe that we find ourselves in, it's just not the kind of universe that you would expect given theism.
There are even more ideas about how the universe could be eternal given this entropy argument. One is that the entropy is actually an observer-dependent effect, or that it's not that the universe really was in a low entropy state. It just seemed that way to us, in the same way that the sun seems like it's rising and setting, but it doesn't really rise and set. So that's another possibility. And of course, if the universe entropy is infinite, then it will always be infinite, and it always has been infinite. So that's another possibility. It's interesting, as Craig, mentioned the wall theorem and things like that. We covered that in our Kalam video. Now, he did reply, and then we did a counter reply, and there's never been a reply to that, And so here we go again, another round, but he hasn't actually answered what was in the previous round.
I know he mentioned the stuff about the philosophical case. I mean, I've covered this ad nauseum, of course, in my Kalam playlist, where I have on scholars to talk about their work on these sorts of things. I talk about my work on these sorts of things. He mentioned the Hilbert's Hotel style argument and the successive addition style argument. I've done videos on both of those, including many hours long, drawing on panoplies of literature on these topics. And of course, he mentioned the Benedetti paradoxes, which I published like 5 or 6 papers on this, criticizing this at this point. I'm not sure how much Craig is sort of up to date with the criticisms of the Proust and Kuhn stuff. I know in a video that Cameron Bertuzzi did with William Lane Craig a while back, Cameron Bertuzzi, once Craig mentioned the sorts of Benedetti paradox motivations for the finitude of the past, and saying that he was sort of convinced by them, Cameron actually asked Craig whether or not he had heard of the unsatisfiable paradiagnosis, or UPD, and Craig hadn't even heard of it. So I'm not even sure that Craig is up on the literature, even criticizing these sorts of arguments, and we have some evidence that he isn't. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. These arguments have been criticized ad nauseum in the philosophical literature, and most philosophers aren't convinced by them.
I have not listened to this entire podcast. I've only seen the excerpts you've picked. So if some things go unresponded to, I hope that our listeners will be tolerant of that, and that the responses that we do offer to these clips will be helpful.
All right. So I did just want to say something briefly about this methodology. I understand that there are limitations on Dr. Craig's time, and that our video was 2 hours. So I understand that he may not be able to either fit that into his schedule or something like that. But there are some limitations with this kind of approach. And I think it's very natural for the people who are producing the video to be somewhat frustrated at the approach being taken here. So someone else on his podcast team presumably was tasked with finding 5 salient points of criticism among maybe the I don't know, 24 criticisms that we leveled in the video or something like that. And then playing those clips abstracted from their broader context and abstracted from other places in the video where we may very well have responded to what Craig is saying. So for instance, Craig just brought up the thermodynamics point. We responded to that elsewhere in the video. So I do think there are legitimate criticisms that one might level to this sort of approach, this sort of modus operandi, this way of going about doing response videos. Us three, we are genuinely interested in what Craig himself would say to our various responses. We think we can learn something. We think Craig might be able to learn something as well. We think everyone can learn things from this sort of endeavor. And to just respond to 5 salient clips that someone else has picked out doesn't seem to do justice to that kind of productive exchange of ideas. So insofar as we're interested in the productive exchange of ideas, I at least wish he would have taken a different approach, and I can at least level that as my perspective on this. I don't know if you guys have anything to say.
Maybe some of our audience knows. I've been publishing on the Kalam argument for several years now, and responding to Craig's case from physics. There really hasn't been many responses at all, and certainly Craig hasn't delivered a published response. It would have been nice to see some sort of response, at least in the form of a blog. Now, of course, he does respond to some of the things that I say in the other video, but that's very far from giving an adequate response to the various objections that I've raised in the peer-reviewed literature. And it's not like I'm publishing in journals that no one has heard of. Right? I'm publishing in major journals, and yet it just seems like there's silence. I have heard him say somewhere that, if I recall correctly, that he plans to respond to me in his systematic theology book. So I look forward to seeing what he says there.
Yeah, I hope so. I also look forward to that. And maybe we can even make a video about your responses to that once that comes out. So sure. Stay tuned, audience. I don't know, Phil, you have any comments on this? Or we can just...
It's a missed opportunity, isn't it? We had really substantive criticisms, I feel. And to just get someone else to pick a couple of clips and then give the same old hackneyed replies, it just feels like a missed opportunity. Doesn't he want to engage with his best critics? And okay, maybe I'm being arrogant to think we are the best critics, but I do think we're better than the average internet atheist. And,
right, we're not like the poo-flinging new atheists who are just like, right. Well, you've committed the composition fallacy, Dr. Craig. Like,
yeah, I think we have something a little bit better than that. So it's a shame.
And there's more on Question of the Week, number 912. If you'd like to pursue this more, you addressed a lot of this on Question of the Week, number 912 at reasonablefaith.org. So everybody can check that out. This first clip is Joe Schmidt and his guest, Dr. Daniel Linford and Phil Halper, talking about Hawking and the latest consensus. Here's the first clip.
The main comment to make is everyone agrees that it's the singularity theorem that gives you the justification for the beginning of the universe, and the singularity theorem can't be trusted. Now, Hawking was saying, well, I still think there's a beginning, but you have to unpack why does he think that? And I've been in his office and I've interviewed him and I've spoken to his colleagues, and I think the reason is that he interprets the Hartle-Hawking model as still having a beginning, and so he thinks there's still a beginning in quantum cosmology. But what you have to understand is that there's lots of different competing quantum cosmologies, and they don't all say the universe has a beginning. Right. And as we said, the beginning of the Hartle-Hawking model is in imaginary time anyway, which Craig cannot buy into. So, yeah, it's extremely problematic for Craig.
Yeah, and there's currently no expert consensus among cosmologists and physicists about which of those models is the correct one, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Well, by my count, 3 things there, Bill. The singularity theorem, Hawking's interpretation points to a beginning, but there's no consensus on the models.
Mm-hmm. These matters are all discussed, Kevin, in Jim Sinclair and my article on the Kalam cosmological argument in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. And anyone who wants to study the arguments in support of the second premise really needs to look at that article by Sinclair and me. Now, as Sinclair explains in that article, the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorems have certain very general conditions that one can deny in an effort to avoid the beginning of the universe. And in our article, Sinclair lists the classes of models that deny the conditions, and then he assesses their viability. Now, the Hartle-Hawking model that he mentioned is an exercise in quantum cosmology that affirms the second premise, the beginning of the universe. It was very interesting that in his interview with Stephen Hawking, Hawking doubled down on that fact and said that his model does imply that the universe began to exist. But the Hartle-Hawking model doesn't do anything to explain the beginning of the universe. I myself sat with James Hartle in his office at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he said to me that the model does not in any way show that the universe could have come into being without a cause from nothing. So the Hartle-Hawking model itself is supportive of that second premise. Now, of course, there's no consensus on which specific model of the universe with a beginning is true. But the relevant point is that no model with an infinite past is mathematically and physically tenable. So the true model, whichever it turns out to be, will belong to the class of models that has a beginning.
There's a lot of philosophical sleight of hand here. And if you just pay a little bit of attention to the moves, you can see all the tricks going on. So the first trick is that the Hartle-Hawking model has a beginning. But the point is that people don't agree about that, right? So there's a question of interpretation. It's certainly true that Hawking thought it had a beginning, and his colleague Hertog also thinks that. But Jim Hartle seemed to have a different view. And I'll quote you, Aaron, because I actually, spent some time with Jim Hartle as well. And my impression is that he didn't think the universe had a beginning. But I'll quote you from Aaron Wall, a Christian physicist that did his postdoc with Jim Hartle. So let me just read out a little bit of this quote that was on his blog. Quote, "The Hartle-Hawking model doesn't actually have a beginning. At least it probably doesn't have a beginning, not in the traditional sense of the word. To the extent that we can reliably extract predictions from it at all, one typically obtains an eternal universe, something like a de Sitter spacetime. This is an eternal spacetime which contracts down to a minimum size and then expands." Close quote. Now, then someone challenged him in the sort of dialogue, comment section, sorry. And then, so Wall replied, open quote, "Would it be helpful if I said that Jim Hartle, who goes to USCB, is a personal friend of mine, and I've seen him give seminars about the Hartle-Hawking proposal in which it was quite clear that he believes the state predicted are eternal with respect to real time and have a bounce." Close quote, open quote again. "I'm not claiming infallibility here. What I'm claiming is the knowledge via professional expertise, social networking, and it is generally expected that the HH proposal gives the state somewhat like de Sitter spacetime. And it is a fact that de Sitter spacetime is eternal and has a bounce in it," close quote. Now, his reply was, well, Jim Hartle doesn't think the universe came out of nothing for no cause. But that's a non sequitur, right? That's not what we're debating. We're debating, does the model have a beginning or not? So if it doesn't have a beginning, well, it wouldn't come out of nowhere with no cause, right? So you see the switcheroo going on, right? Then he says there are no models that are eternal into the past that are viable. He just asserts that. Right, but there are loads of models that are eternal into the past and that physicists take seriously. We've just put a new video out on a model that actually we didn't cover in the book, asymptotically safe gravity. Asymptotically safe gravity, I think, has some quite strong plausibility to it because it actually seemed to predict the correct value for the Higgs. And I just spoke to Kashweterik, and he says, nope, there's no beginning in our model. Other models, as quantum gravity, loop quantum gravity, for example, has a bounce and is considered eternal into the past, or at least could be, So he just asserts this without any justification, nothing. Then he goes, but we wrote all about it in the Blackwell Companion. But the Blackwell Companion is just got stuff wrong. I mean, to come back to loop quantum gravity, they said, well, this has been ruled out because dark energy was discovered, showing that the universe is not going to contract back down. But the model doesn't say the universe is going to contract back down. That's completely irrelevant. It's like you didn't understand what the theory predicts. Incidentally, by the way, on our YouTube channel, we've just had new results from the dark energy spectrographic instrument that may imply that dark energy is not a constant. And so if it's weakening over time, which is what they find, actually the universe could contract back down. We'll wait to see if that really gets firmed up. I mean, we should always be cautious about new results.
You're saying we can't just quote physicists and then settle the debate?
Right. I know. Crazy, huh?
Yeah. I mean, there's a really important point here. So, so Phil is right that there are various things that Craig and Sinclair get wrong in their actually have two co-authored articles, but both of those articles get various things wrong. I think there's a way that we can look at this from a more meta level perspective, right? That's what philosophers sometimes do, is they take a step back and they say, well, what is the argument that's even here? What is the argument that's supposed to be? The argument they present is something like this. They say, look, if the universe didn't have a beginning, then it has to fall into one of these families of models that they discuss. And then they point out that various models that fit into those families have problems of various sorts. So they want to say that each individual model within each of the families is improbable. Well, even if all those arguments were correct, even if they did successfully show that each cosmological model without a beginning was improbable, that would not show that the universe probably did have a beginning. Why not? Well, because for sort of two reasons. First of all, the probability of a disjunction is always larger than the probability of each individual disjunct. So for example, suppose that we wanted to know what the probability was that I had Cheerios or cornflakes for breakfast this morning. Well, the probability that I had Cheerios or cornflakes, if you draw it like a Venn diagram, imagine that you draw it a Venn diagram, right? There's then three locations in our Venn diagram. There's the location of the Venn diagram where I have only Cheerios. There's the middle where the two circles overlap, where I have both Cheerios and cornflakes. And then there's the portion of the second circle where I only have, I think, cornflakes, right? If the other one is Cheerios. Now, the probability of the disjunction, that's what you get from shading in the entire, like both of the circles, including their overlap. Whereas the probability that of each of the disjuncts, that's just the area represented by each circle, right? So if you shade in both of the circles together, then that's a larger region than either of the two circles. So that's one reason, is that the probability of the disjunction of all the models is going to be larger than the probability of each disjunct. So if it's true that each disjunct, each possibility is improbable, that doesn't mean the whole thing is improbable. Now here's the other problem with that kind of argument, is that really when we evaluate scientific theories, it's more like having three circles, where you have cornflakes, where you have Cheerios, and you have a third circle that you label maybe with a question mark, because it's this unconceived alternative. That's what people call it in the literature, right? So in this case would be an additional way of having a universe without a beginning that no one's thought of yet. And then the probability of not having a beginning is not the probability of the two circles shaded, but actually is the probability is represented by shading in all three circles. Right, so you have to include all of that, not just the ways that we've thought of so far, not the probability of any given hypothesis, but the probability of the disjunction between all the hypotheses, including all the hypotheses we haven't thought of yet. And Craig and Sinclair in no article respond to that. All they do is show that each individual model is improbable in various respects. And then they, of course, also neglect to carry out the same kind of analysis for models in which there is a beginning. I mean, if you suppose that it was right to carry out the analysis as they did it, to show that each individual hypothesis was improbable, well, then if you also carried out that analysis for models with a beginning, well, then since we don't have a model with a beginning that's probable, what they would conclude, if they were consistent, is that it's improbable that the universe has a beginning, right? So either they follow through on their methodology they lay out, in which case, to be consistent, they should say that it's improbable the universe has a beginning, or they should say that it's the wrong methodology to begin with, in which case they haven't actually shown, that they haven't justified the conclusion that it's improbable that the universe has a beginning. Sorry, that the universe does not have a beginning.
Right. And Dan, you also published at least one response to Craig and Sinclair, right? The Eric Kentness article, Big Bounce or Double Bang, a reply to Craig and Sinclair on the implementation of bounce cosmologies.
That's one response. There's also my article entitled "The Kalam Cosmological Argument Meets the Mentaculus." Both of those articles were in response to what they do in the Craig and Sinclair article, and what they take them to task for in those two articles is their interpretation of those models. Because, as I brought out last time, I don't think that we have a probable cosmological model, right? I think all the models are improbable. So when Craig wants to remind us that for various reasons that he thinks are correct, that various beginningless models are improbable, I can concede that. Though I'm not going to concede that he's saying that for the right reasons.
There's only like two models at the beginning that I think he ever mentions. One is the Vilenkin tunneling from nothing model, which he criticized in his article Review of Many Worlds in One, saying it doesn't work. And the other is the Hartle-Hawking model, which he also criticized. In fact, I just got a little quote from him on this. This is Craig's own view of it. He says, Hawking does not really eliminate the singularity. He conceals it behind the physically unintelligible artifice of imaginary time. So it's a bit rich for him to sort of say, well, the only viable models are the ones with a beginning, when he doesn't think that the ones he actually quotes are actually viable.
Next clip, Linford questions your use of the singularity theorems and classical spacetime. Next clip.
And Craig will admit that, yes, we don't know that the universe began in a singularity. And then he wants to go on to say that, nonetheless, we somehow do know the universe began. I don't understand this on two levels. One level I don't understand it is that he uses the singularity theorems to try to support what he's saying. And on the other hand, I don't understand it because the only reason at all that anyone thinks that these various physical models give us a beginning is because they have things like singularities in them. Once you give up those results, once you say, oh, we can't trust the singularity theorems because they were produced in the context of, for example, classical spacetimes, but we know that there has to be some quantum gravity theories, so that spacetime isn't actually classical. Well, then it's the same moment when you give up any justification you had for thinking that there was going to be a physical theory that told you about the beginning of the universe in the first place. So it's just sort of bizarre that he wants to somehow make himself a road in between these results.
Well, how are you using the various singularity theorems to support your view, Bill? And what about classical spacetime?
There's nothing bizarre here, Kevin. The singularity theorems make it clear that under more and more general conditions, an initial cosmological singularity is inevitable. For example, the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem makes an advance on the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorems by having only one condition on which the beginning of the universe is physically necessary. Now, you can avoid the singularity by denying that one condition of the BGV theorem. But Sinclair and Vilenkin emphasize that the resultant models are faced with a plethora of problems that preclude there being physically reasonable models. In fact, the most recent work on the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem from just last August shows that you've basically got only three options of classes of models. These are discussed in Question of the Week 912. Carballo-Rubio and his colleagues in their article Geodesically Complete Universes from August of 2024 show that all viable singularity-free classical geometries must feature either, one, a bouncing universe where the universe contracts and then bounces back to a new expansion, or two, an emergent universe where the universe lies dormant from eternity past and then a finite time ago suddenly begins to expand, or three, an asymptotically emergent universe in which the beginning of the universe is pushed back to minus infinity. And none of these classes of models is physically reasonable. So we can be relatively sure that the correct model will belong to that class of models that obeys the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and features a beginning and a finite past.
So he quotes this paper, and then he says, oh, there's only three classes of models that will escape, that will get rid of the singularity. And then he says, and none of them are viable. Right. But remember, what people have to notice is that that's his view. It's not their view. It's not the authors of that paper's view. And in fact, one of the authors of that paper is someone I know. He's actually going to be in one of my upcoming films. And that's Stefano Liberati. And here's a quote from him that I got today. Right. So I just quickly emailed him. He says there are quantum gravity inspired calculations producing all of these three scenarios. So I cannot say that any of them are excluded, right? So the people that he's quoting disagree with him. No surprise. That happens a lot. So you see these sorts of sleights of hands, right? Notice that he didn't really mention the fact, there's another paper saying the BGV theorem is flawed.
In fairness, Greg, I think that's what he tries to tackle in the question of the week that he mentioned at the beginning of the episode. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
No, he does. I've had a look at that article, and I don't think it's very good reply. That paper is, it's all a bit too new, and that's fair enough. It is a bit new, but you could imagine if it had the opposite conclusion. I can assure you, he wouldn't be saying, this is too new. He'd be quoting it left, right, and center. Quite frankly, one scenario is enough to violate the theorem. Like, that's enough. What's the problem with three? I don't understand, what this big objection is even supposed to be.
Well, I think what he's trying to say is that, so he's making this claim that any model that doesn't satisfy the conditions for the BGV theorem is such that it will fall into one of these three categories. But in fact, that's not true. So it's just all too easy to come up with models that don't satisfy the conditions of the BGV theorem and that don't fall into one of these three categories. So here, let me show you that can be done. So the BGV theorem says that if you have a geodesic or a curve through space-time, like a curve that a particle or a person could travel along, or a curve that light could go along, then if the universe is on average expanding along that trajectory, along that curve, then the curve cannot be extended indefinitely into the past. That's all it says. Now, here's one thing you can do. You can imagine you can have a space-time where there's a point missing. That's a space-time in which if you have a curve that goes back to that point, it can't be extended any further because the point is missing from that particular location. And yet you can have other regions in that same space-time in which the universe is not expanding. Now, the model that I just gave you is a very simple example. There's no reason to think that it's physically realistic, but the point here isn't to generate a physically realistic model. The point is to generate a model that future physically realistic models may share some features with. So for all we know, a model that someone comes up with in the future could be such that you have expansion within one region, and then there's other regions where there is no expansion. Models like that are actually not too difficult to write down. People who are working on the inflationary multiverse write down models like that all the time. What they imagine is that you have some background de Sitter space-time, and then you can have regions, they call them bubble universes, within that background de Sitter space-time. Now, that's a particular proposal for how this could go, but the larger point from the perspective of mathematical physics is that you can embed smaller expanding regions that look like our Big Bang within a larger background space-time that doesn't have a beginning. And you can then do all kinds of things, play all kinds of games if you want with space-times like that. And the BGV theorem might be satisfied within one particular region because you might have one curve in that region along which space-time is expanding. But then you have other regions in which the conditions for the BGV theorem just don't apply. And so this whole thought that the universe must fall into one of these three categories is just preposterous if you understand what the BGV theorem actually in fact says.
This next clip, they talk about the probability of beginningless cosmological models, and they offer a challenge. It's clip number 3.
What is to me a really crucial central point, which is just the following. Craig, in many of his papers, and sometimes these are co-authored with people like James Sinclair, argues that no particular cosmological model, that is, no particular beginningless cosmological model is probable. So we don't need to go through Craig's entire argument to show that no individual beginningless cosmological model is probable. We already knew that. And anyone who has their ear on the ground in physics and understands what it is that physicists are interested in and what they're currently working on knows that there just is no beginningless cosmological model that is probable. And likewise, there's no cosmological model with a beginning that's probable. No cosmological model is probable. And so it shouldn't be that the whole discussion shouldn't be about whether or not we have any specific cosmological model that's probable. We already know that there is one.
Challenge for Craig. Tell us which cosmological model you think is probable.
Right.
Of the very early universe, right?
Yeah,
Not
right.
about, expansion from a hot dense state, but, something that happened, maybe before inflation, if inflation happened.
Yeah, something beyond just traditional Big Bang cosmology, something that doesn't look like it was just written down in the 1950s. If you can do that, then that would be interesting and impressive, but it also involve him putting his neck out on the line.
All right, several things there, Bill. And the challenge is for you to show which current model is probable.
The challenge is misconceived, Kevin, but it is so in a philosophically interesting way. The question is, which classes of models are physically tenable? Models featuring an infinite past are physically untenable. They cannot be right. By contrast, models with a beginning are at least physically tenable, such as the Vilenkin model or the Hartle-Hawking model. The evidence can thus rule out certain classes of models without indicating which one of the remaining tenable models is the most probable one. To give a homey analogy to make this clear, imagine that the police are investigating who murdered the master of the house. And suppose that the evidence rules out that somebody outside the household committed the murder. We know on the basis of the evidence that the murderer was someone within the household, but the evidence doesn't yet determine which member of the household murdered the master. Now, to give a scientific example closer to the beginning of the universe, consider physical mechanics. The evidence rules out Newtonian mechanics. The evidence supports some theory of quantum mechanics. Now, as yet, we don't yet know which specific theory of quantum mechanics is correct. We need more evidence. But we can be very confident that the correct theory of mechanics will be a quantum mechanics. Now, it's similar with models of the origin of the universe. The evidence rules out pretty decisively beginningless models, but we don't yet know which model with a beginning is correct. Further exploration is needed to proceed to figure out which one of these is best supported by the evidence. Now, the point I'm making can be expressed a bit more technically by saying that relative to a body of evidence, a more general hypothesis is much more probable than a more specific hypothesis. As one adds more and more specifics to a hypothesis, it becomes less and less probable relative to the same body of evidence. The general hypothesis, the universe began to exist, is vastly more probable than its negation, even though the evidence is insufficient to show which specific model with a beginning is the true one.
There's a couple of things to say here. Firstly, he didn't give any argument as to why the beginningless models were ruled out. He just asserted it. And that, I don't think that's very good philosophy. Now, maybe he's relying on his previous arguments, Hilbert Hotel, but we've covered those in other material. So in this particular podcast, there's absolutely no argument as to why these beginningless models are supposedly ruled out. Notice again that the only two models that he mentioned that have a beginning are the Hartle-Hawking and the tunneling from nothing model, both of which in other materials he's sort of railed against. Now, the whole point of asking him, well, which specific model was in the context of what Dan talked about before. The problem is that the way his methodology for ruling out beginningless models was to go through each one and find a problem with them and say, aha, that one then we'll rule out because it's got a problem. But what we're arguing is, you can do exactly the same for any model with a beginning. I can point you criticisms of the Hartle-Hawking model. I can point you criticisms of the tunneling from nothing model. In fact, I can give you your own criticisms of them, And so that's why we raise this challenge, because that's the methodology that he picked, right? So if he uses that methodology, so can we. So that's why I think the whole reply is misconstrued.
And it seems like he thinks that when it comes to ruling out a beginningless model, the methodology that he employs is somewhat reminiscent of an argument by elimination, right? So if you're doing a deductive proof and you're able to eliminate all of the options on one side of a disjunction, then you can infer that the other disjunct must be true. Unfortunately, that's not the way that it works with scientific confirmation. On one hand, his methodology is just wrong from the get-go, because what we should be doing on both sides, both with respect to models that have no beginning and models that have a beginning, is that the fact that the individual models in each of those two families may be improbable just does not in any way entail that either of those two families is improbable. So that's why the methodology is wrong on the one hand. But then on the other, if we apply that, if we whatever reason we apply that methodology consistently, if we do what Craig does, but with respect to models that have a beginning, then just as Craig often asks his interlocutor to produce a plausible beginningless cosmological model, so too we have the right to ask him to produce a plausible cosmological model with a beginning. Now, I think it's worth bringing up too why it is that I say that we don't have any probable cosmological models. So a few years ago, someone emailed me and asked me what I thought of Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology. Now, there's many different problems with Penrose's model, but actually my answer to that question about what I think of the plausibility of the model has very little to do with the various controversial assumptions the model makes. It just comes from reflecting on the fact that if you think that there's more than two live cosmological models, more than two models that are worth exploring, that have some not insignificant portion of the probability space, well, then you have to say that there's no model that's more than 50% probable, right? So in that case, you have to say that Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology, for example, is improbable. If we go back to Craig's example of the murder suspects, there's 5 people inside the house, and supposing that we go along with this example that we don't know it's someone, somehow we know that's not someone outside of the house, well then, if we have pretty good reason to think that it's every one of those 5, then none of the 5 can in fact be probable, right? I mean, if it's equally probable among all 5, for example, then the probability of each one has to be 1/5, and so it has to be less than 1/2. And so with respect to an area where we have as much controversy, as much scientific controversy as physical cosmology, we cannot say that any one model is probable. And so then we can't make the inference that Craig wants to make from any individual model not being probable. We can't make the inference that's improbable that the universe is beginningless.
Yeah, so just to put some actual numbers on this, in our book, I think we have 25 different models for the early universe that we mentioned. Some of them have whole chapters, some of them only have like 1 or 2 sentences. But that's the sort of numbers that we're actually looking at. So the chances of any one of them right, if you want to just treat them all equal probable, is like 4%.
Yeah.
So, of course.
And I think the other thing to be brought out here is that when introducing many of these models, cosmologists are not actually proposing something that they think is a way that the universe could really be. Instead, what they typically do is they introduce a model to make a point, right? So if someone comes out with a result that says, oh, it looks like it's improbable or implausible that we're going to have models that can have these features. And then someone says, oh yeah, well, here's a model that does have those features. That's the way in which the literature on cosmological models often progresses. And given that that's the way that the literature often progresses, we come back to this point that I made earlier, that it's not about producing a model that is the way the universe really is. It's instead finding a model that may have features that the actual universe may have. Right? That's a way of looking at cosmological models that goes back to Robert Garrick. I hope I pronounced that name correctly, but goes back to Garrick in the 1970s, who famously said that. Famously made this exact point, that the point of introducing various models of various space-time models, and in his case, is that the various space-time models one can produce may have features that may be in common with realistic cosmologies, even if the space-time model introduced is not itself a realistic model.
Although I should add, Dan, that in our book, we cover various different models. Some of them are very broad brush stroke ideas, just general principles. Some of them, they actually are much more precise, and they actually try and calculate like exactly what the CMB should look like if this would happen. Those ones I take to be, a lot more thorough and more potentially realistic. But the bottom line is there are a lot, so none of them should be taken to be particularly probable. I mean, some people might say inflation is the one that's, that's got the most consensus to it. So maybe you shouldn't treat them all equally probable. But nevertheless, we still want to know what happened before inflation. So the point is, he's just not being consistent.
I mean, Sean
he ruled out individual models and then said, so therefore the beginningless ones are out. We can just do exactly the same with the ones with the beginning.
Right. So Sean Carroll, for instance, has said that he personally has a credence of 50% that inflation is correct.
That's right.
So, if someone like Carroll has that kind of credence, I think that's worth other people keeping in mind. That those are the kinds of numbers that we're dealing. We're dealing with an area of science that, as of yet, is very uncertain, and in which there's many questions that we've left to answer. To come down on one side or the other is just really premature, I think.
This is ultimately going back to the misrepresentation or mischaracterization point. We are not claiming that Craig is intentionally misrepresenting or intentionally mischaracterizing science or the state of science or the relevant evidence. But mischaracterization is still a mischaracterization. And this is where I think that the mischaracterization charge comes in. Craig is saying that these model, any beginningless model, cannot be right. He said cannot be right in there. He says the evidence decisively rules them all out. He said that they're totally physically untenable, okay? It's these sorts of things which I think are mischaracterizing the state of science. It's just not the case among the relevant cosmologists, among the relevant physicists, as we demonstrated in our previous episode. One way that we can bring out this mischaracterization charge also is that is Craig or is Craig not giving the impression to his audience? This is a question. Is Craig or is Craig not giving the impression to his audience that this is established science? This is a settled question among the relevant experts that beginningless models are out and models with a beginning are the only live ones. Is Craig or is Craig not giving? I'm posing that question to the audience. I think the answer is obvious. Craig is clearly giving the impression to his audience by means of his various quotations and by means of what he's saying that this is a matter of established science and that this is a settled question among the relevant experts. But that is not the case. That's ultimately where our charge of mischaracterization comes from, and I don't think Craig adequately assuages the charge. So we've responded to one of Craig's procedures for trying to argue for the physical untenability of any beginningless model, which is to look at each model and try to say that there are decisive problems for each model, and then try to rule out the disjunction of all of them on the basis of that, as well as the disjunction of any conceivable model which shares the relevant features with them. We've examined why that sort of procedure can't work and why that's bad reasoning. But what he might be trying to get at in saying that we can rule all these out, say that they cannot be right, that the evidence decisively rules them out, is to try to point to his various other things, his various other arguments from, hey, the BGV theorem, and hey, the thermodynamic gradient, and hey, all these other sorts of things. And of course, the problem with appealing to that is that in our previous video, we responded to each one of these appeals and explained why they don't show that no beginningless model could be correct. Let me just read what we said about the BGV theorem. This is in a pinned comment where I summarized everything that we said. We gave roughly 5 responses to it. First, at best, the BGV theorem shows that a space-time region, which has been expanding on average throughout its history, could not have been expanding forever. Such an expanding region must have begun its expansion at some finitely distant point in the past. This does not imply that all of space-time itself has a beginning, because all of space-time may not have been expanding on average throughout its history. In such a case, the BGV theorem would be inapplicable to the whole of space-time itself. In fact, as pointed out in the video, both Guth and Vilenkin explicitly say that the BGV theorem only says that the inflation of the universe has a beginning. It doesn't say that the universe as a whole or space-time as a whole has a beginning. Secondly, recent literature purports to give grounds to doubt the BGV theorem. Whether or not this recent literature is correct, it reveals that this is not a settled issue among the relevant experts. Instead, it's an active area of research and debate. Relevant papers here include Lesnevsky et al. In 2023, Nijani or whatever. I don't know how to pronounce these things in 2023. Nomura, Anthony Aguirre, etc. Okay. That's the second point that we make. The third point that we make is that the BGV theorem is only a theorem about classical spacetimes. But we probably don't live in a classical spacetime. We have good reasons internal to the standard model and general relativity for thinking that these theories will be surpassed by a new theory able to incorporate both. So our current understanding of spacetime will be replaced by something else. So the BGV theorem does not apply to the spacetime we live in. Fourth, even if we do live in a classical spacetime, the Manchak theorems show that in all likelihood, we couldn't ever know enough about the global structure of spacetime to know that the whole of spatiotemporal reality had a beginning. And fifth, and finally, even if the BGV theorem shows that the past is finite, and as explained, it doesn't, we cannot infer that the universe, that is the totality of all of physical reality, began to exist, precisely because past finitude does not entail beginning to exist, which is what we're about to get on in the video. And earlier in this video, we responded to his point about thermodynamics, etc. So again, this is where it would be helpful not to have one of Craig's assistants handpick 5 clips of the video that are 45 seconds long or something, and then have Craig to respond to those. Because some of Craig's reasons for ruling out and thinking that the evidence decisively rules out beginningless models are things we explicitly addressed in the video and which Craig doesn't address here. So what's going on? We've lost the plot.
Let's check out this next clip. Linford brings up your theological views on God and time. Clip number 4.
I think the only last point I want to make here is that we have purely philosophical reasons for thinking that the BGV theorem has no importance for whether the universe has a beginning. And that's that. So Craig thinks that God entered time, a finite time, into the past. Craig also thinks that God is beginningless. Therefore, Craig thinks that there are things that have a finite past that have only existed for a finite time and yet are beginningless. The BGV theorem at most tells us that the universe has been around for a finite time. But given Craig's own theological view, it's just false that if something has been around for a finite time, that alone would suffice for showing that it had a beginning. So Craig needs to take an extra step. He needs to show us with a convincing argument what the extra condition is to add to having a finite past that suffices for having a beginning. And then he needs to show that the universe satisfies that condition, whatever that condition is.
So can you take the extra step that he's asking for, Bill?
I've already taken it, Kevin. In deducing the properties of the first uncaused cause, I've argued that no physical entity can exist timelessly and changelessly, and therefore the cause of the universe must be an immaterial, transcendent being. Now, it's true that something can exist for only a finite time and yet be beginningless if it exists timelessly without the universe. But no physical entity can exist timelessly, and therefore the origin of the universe cannot be out of a quiescent universe that is causally prior to time.
I mean, first of all, as far as prior videos go, Joe and I did an entire, quite long video on the, people call it the gap problem. So you get to the end of the Kalam argument, or the first stage of the Kalam argument anyway, and you say, okay, so the universe had a cause, and now they try to fill in the rest of the gap to get to God, right? So they try to argue that God has, or that the creator of the universe, rather, the cause of the universe, has various sorts of divine attributes. Among them, in this case, is that sans the universe, the cause of the universe is supposed to be timeless. Now, I have a paper published in Urkentness that Craig has yet to respond to or make any mention of. I go through several of the proposals that Craig has tried to give to modify the definition of beginning to exist so that he can distinguish between entities that have a finite past but no beginning and entities that have a finite past and have a beginning. And I show that the various proposals that Craig has come up with don't appear to work. But let's suppose that one of Craig's proposals does work. Craig thinks that he can somehow show that the no physical entity could have those features. A no physical entity could have, for example, a timeless phase in its life. But I don't understand how Craig can possibly say that. First of all, we have current theories. Granted, they are speculative theories, but people have hypotheses on the table in which there are all sorts of timeless entities. In some conceptions is the universal wave function, for example. The universal wave function is not spatiotemporal. Sean Carroll has a slightly different view in which it's not the universal wave function per se, but it's the state vector of the of the universe.
This is another problem of their approach of taking a few isolated clips and responding to them. Why? Well, because in our video, we explicitly mentioned this view about the universal wave function being proposed in various views by various philosophers in various literatures as a non-spatiotemporal, but nevertheless physical entity. And we cite various pieces of literature. We pointed the audience to chapter 8 of our book, where we give a bunch of references. We even try to motivate some of these sorts of views, give preliminary sketches of motivations. So again, if Craig hadn't taken this approach, he would have seen that, lo and behold, we already responded to what he's saying.
Yeah, well, that's right. And we can bring up other models as well. Like, so for instance, there are some people who, I think Carlo Avelli is one of them, who think of loop quantum gravity as fundamentally non-spatiotemporal. The point here, though, is that since we have live proposals for non-temporal entities that are also physical, I don't see how Craig can come to the conclusion that there couldn't be a non-temporal physical entity. And by the way, he can't just, this is the point we made before too, he can't just rule out every one of the proposed non-temporal physical entities and then declare, therefore, there couldn't be a non-temporal physical entity, right? It could be that there's a non-temporal physical entity that no one's thought of yet, an unconceived alternative. In fact, one way that you could have an argument for such an entity is to take Craig's argument and just sort of flip it around, right? Say, okay, this Coulomb cosmological argument, it turns out, works, and it requires as a cause of space-time there to be a non-temporal entity. Oh, but by the way, we have other independent reasons, perhaps, for thinking that there couldn't be non-physical entities. If you had that kind of view, then you would just have an argument that there therefore is some sort of physical non-temporal entity, perhaps one whose other features we are as yet agnostic about. I don't know why that's something that he can suddenly rule out.
Well, I can tell you how he tries to rule it out. Well, Phil, I'll let you say something and then I'll try to add that.
I think there is also maybe an ambiguity in what we mean by physical. So, for example, a lot of physicists might think that there's a quantum mechanical description of the universe that doesn't have an analog to anything in our sort of everyday world. So is that physical? Like, what do you mean by physical? My co-author, Nia Shafshordi, has just written a paper about black holes, and he calls them complex power balls because they have a power law, but they're described only in the mathematics in the complex plane. Vilenkin's tunneling from nothing proposal suggests that he wouldn't use the word causality, but in some sense the universe owes its existence to the laws of physics, that they have this sort of Platonic existence, that they exist somehow without any physical universe to describe them. Is that physical? I don't know. I mean, you see that there's an ambiguity here. It's certainly not the sort of normal sort of Newtonian view of physics that people are used to. Emergent space-time, another possibility. So there's all kinds of ideas that people play with of, potentially timeless entities that would, in some sense, bring the universe into being. They seem, at least as plausible as an immaterial mind doing it.
Right. And I mean, we can, if people don't like the term physical, we can also use the term like describable by the terms and ideology and investigative practices of physics or something like that. So people can substitute that. But as to Dan's point, where how does Craig thinks he's like ruling these sorts of things out? Well, I did find one place where he says he's like argued for this elsewhere. The arguments here, there's usually a total paucity of arguments in this case. It's usually just flatly asserted that you can't have non-spatiotemporal physical things. Nowhere, for instance, does Craig ever address non-spatiotemporal universal wave function or these other proposals that we're mentioning, which he would need to do if he wants to rule this out. But in question of the week, number 391, Craig gives us a quote-unquote argument. I'm not sure we should afford it that appellation, but so he says, as to your last question, I can't think of any other kind of object which philosophers have taken to exist timelessly, apart from God and various abstract objects. No material concrete object can exist timelessly, since there will always be at least atomic motion going on. So, a timelessly existing concrete object other than God would have to be something like an angelic being, but these are not normally taken to exist timelessly. End quote. Okay. So apparently we've got an argument here that no material thing can be timeless because, quote, there will always be at least atomic motion going on.
Yeah, and this is just nonsense. I mean,
this is the level of argumentation that we're dealing with. I mean, I can't believe it. But I just want to say a few things about this. So, I mean, for starters, Craig just asserts without any justification that there will always be at least atomic motion going on. In fact, to me, this just seems to beg the very question at issue, right? The very question at issue is whether there could be a timeless and hence motionless physical thing. And so to assert that any physical thing must involve physical motion, must involve the motion of atomic particles or something like that, is simply to assume the very thing in question. If there were to be a non-spatiotemporal physical thing, it obviously wouldn't be something composed of atomic motion, something composed of atoms moving. So he just totally seems to be missing the mark here. And he's also just wrong that there must be atomic motion going on. We know for a fact, for instance, that there can be physical things without atomic motion. I mean, in the early stages of the universe, there weren't even atoms. So, what is he saying?
Right.
He also looks epistemically live proposals in physics on which there exist perfectly well-defined, perfectly coherent, timeless physical things. Again, certain views of the universal wave function, a timeless force space, and so on. We've covered these in other videos that Dan and I have put together. And of course, another point worth addressing is that Craig sometimes claims that, hey, quantum systems are in a state of constant flux, and so they can't exist timelessly. But I think this is wrong-headed for several reasons. So first, just because the quantum systems in our experience later on in the universe are constantly changing, it clearly doesn't follow that any possible quantum system whatsoever must constantly change by its very nature. And indeed, we wouldn't expect quantum systems around us now to behave in the same way that they do around the origin of our entire space-time manifold. That's the first point to make in response to that. Secondly, we currently don't have a well-established physical theory that accurately describes the very early universe. And so even if our current understanding of quantum mechanical systems implies or suggests that any quantum system must constantly change, it's illegitimate to apply that current understanding to a situation in which it may very well be inapplicable. So that's yet another problem. And then finally, this is a point that Dan kind of brought up. Even if a physical scientific description of the origin of the universe can't be currently provided, given what we know about quantum systems in our experience, it's still possible to develop philosophical accounts of the cause of the universe in terms of material entities. Craig himself, of course, doesn't offer a scientific account of the cause of the universe, but only a philosophical one. And so we can't criticize the non-theist on this basis. Someone might just say that the beginning of the universe was caused by a new type of particle or field, which is capable of existing changelessly outside of time. Since Craig is the one who is attempting to argue that the universe couldn't have been causally preceded by or non-causally preceded by a non-spatial, non-temporal physical thing, since he's the one who's positively claiming that, he needs that for his argument to go through. The onus or burden of justification is on Craig to rule these sorts of other possibilities out, and he has done no such thing. I just gave basically the two main reasons that I found in his corpus for thinking that there can't be physical changeless things, physical timeless things, and they're both, I just think, terrible reasons.
So the other thing that we brought out here is a point that I don't know why this is brought up more often, but if you go to the library, get out a quantum mechanics textbook, introductory quantum mechanics textbook, flip to the section on the Hamiltonian operator. People who have studied quantum mechanics will know what that is. It's a mathematical device. And read the section on eigenstates, what are called eigenstates of the Hamiltonian operator. You find this in any introductory quantum textbook whatsoever. What you'll find out is that any eigenstate of the Hamiltonian does not evolve in time. So now that's a bunch of mathematical language that people probably don't recognize. But the point is, it's very easy to come up with an example of a system we can describe quantum mechanically, but that does not evolve in time. In fact, in some sense, the problem is the opposite of the one that Craig describes. So if you suppose the early state of the universe was an eigenstate of the universe's Hamiltonian, then it would never evolve in time. It would just always stay frozen. And so the problem in that sense is not trying to figure out how you could have a quantum mechanical system that doesn't evolve with time. That's too easy to get. The problem in that sense is to figure out if you did have such a system, a system, a quantum mechanical system that doesn't evolve through time, how change would begin to take place. Now, in fact, in the various models in which time is reducible, in which space-time is reducible, so like in these models where what's fundamental is a universal wave function, then this idea that there's like an initial state, sort of the wrong way of thinking about what's going on to begin with, right? Because it's the entire space-time that is going to be reducible to the universal wave function. It's not that we have like this sequence of states and then we need to somehow figure out how to make them explicable in terms of something timeless. Rather, in the models in which we have something timeless, is that the way the explanation works is that you have at bedrock something that's fundamentally non-spatiotemporal, and then at some emergent level and some non-fundamental level, you have the entities that are explained in terms of that fundamentalist.
Well, yeah, but Dan, also, we can imagine cooking up a philosophical view as well, which does posit something relevantly analogous to the non-spatiotemporal universal wave function, which nevertheless serves that, as it were, causally initial role that Craig gives to God. So we can imagine cooking up philosophical views there. And again, the onus is on Craig to rule all these sorts of proposals out, and none of his quote-unquote arguments here give us any reason to rule these sorts of things out.
Right. And what he has to do is not rule out any particular example, but show that as a general fact, there couldn't be a non-temporal physical entity.
Yeah, and you can't do that by just saying there's always going to be atomic motion going on.
I just point out that these things have been raised to Craig before. When Sean Carroll debated him, he pointed out this problem of time that Dan was just highlighting in the debate. It's like, if you want to highlight the Hartle-Hawking model or these models, that have a closed sphere, as it were, ones that sort of would violate Carroll's quantum eternity theorem, then you're going to have this problem of time. So this was pointed out like 10 years ago. Similarly, in Vilenkin's model, as we said, there's no atomic motion. There's just the laws of physics. And we know that Craig has read this because he reviewed Vilenkin's book. Right, so it's not like he hasn't come across this idea. Of course he has. He reviewed the book. So he just sort of basically just ignores all these things that have been put in front of him and just pretends they're not there.
One other thing that I want to mention before getting back to the podcast is, we've been talking about purported examples of candidates for timeless physical things, but another way for the universe or the collection or totality of all of physical reality to fail to have a beginning despite having a finite past is for some physical entity or for the universe itself to exist in a state of non-metric time prior to the beginning of metric time. That's an example that we also brought up in our last discussion. We talked about it there in more detail. So that's yet another thing. Craig wouldn't just have to rule out timeless physical realities. He'd also have to rule out physical realities existing in non-metric time prior to the beginning of metric time. So that's yet another thing that Craig would have to rule out. And again, something he has totally failed to rule out.
Final clip. Joe talks about his frustration with defenders of the Kalam. Clip number 5.
It's very frustrating when I see some defenders of the Kalam say that, each model featuring a beginningless past has various problems afflicting it, as if this isn't also true of all the models featuring a beginning. This is precisely why there's still active live debate, massive disagreement among professional cosmologists, physicists, and whatnot concerning which model of the cosmological history of the universe is correct. So I just think apologists and people interested in the Kalam need to stop pretending that there's like some sort of consensus that like the standard Big Bang model of the universe is like just like the correct and final word, and our universe began 13.8 billion years ago. There's far more disagreement than such people let on.
Well, he's back to the consensus thing, sounds like, Bill.
Yes, I'm really sorry to see that Joe Schmidt has been so taken in by these two fellows to think that a defense of the premise that the universe began to exist requires one to prove that a particular model with a beginning is correct. Joe, as a sophisticated philosopher, should know that logically, that simply is not the case. It can be very probable that the universe began to exist, even though any specific or particular model within that class cannot yet be said to be probable.
Okay, so let's pause it there. So apparently I'm being
We've corrupted you, Joe.
yeah,
Yeah,
I'm being
apparently-
taken in. I'm being taken in by these fellows
Apparently,
here.
you are a sophisticated philosopher, but I'm not. Apparently,
Well, he wasn't really. Oh man. Well, let me
that's
just
what
say,
was
listen.
implicit in what he said.
Yeah, I appreciate Craig saying that, and again, I just want to be clear for the audience. I'm not saying that Craig is intentionally misrepresenting science or things like that. Not making any claims about motives whatsoever. But listen, I didn't say or imply that in order to show that the universe began to exist, you have to prove a particular model to be correct. I grant that would be a fallacious inference. What my point there was embedded within a larger context, wherein we are responding to Craig's argument with Sinclair when they run through a variety of particular models, argue that featuring a beginningless universe, argue that each of them faces, in their view, insuperable challenges, and then tries to go from there to thinking that beginningless models as a whole are ruled out. That is what I'm responding to here, and I'm voicing my frustration with that. Nowhere did I say or imply that to justify the claim that the universe began to exist, we have to establish or prove some particular model. It's just not what I was saying.
I think this is a great example of taking stuff out of context, right? Because we did ask him, which model is the right model, but it's in a context of where you're ruling out the beginningless models by going through each model one by one. So we can do the same. We're basically giving a parody argument. And when
We're saying let's play your game.
Exactly. When you give a parody argument, you don't literally think that the argument that you're parodying, is actually like a right methodology. The whole point of it is it's a wrong methodology. So you can't reply by saying it's a wrong methodology.
Right. I mean, and again, that's the context in which I made my comment. Anyway, that was a very frustrating aspect of this, not only because he said that I'm being taken in by you guys, as if, I've been duped by you guys. That was frustrating, but also just frustrating that, listen, Dr. Craig, that was not my argument. And I did say that there is active disagreement among the relevant cosmologists about which model is correct, but I'm not then trying to infer from that what Craig is saying that I'm inferring from that. Instead, what I'm inferring from that is that when there's disagreement among the relevant experts on a question, and it doesn't only span the models with a beginning, but also models without a beginning. So when there's expert disagreement concerning even which of those models is correct, including ones featuring no beginningless models, then we should suspend judgment about whether the universe began to exist. At least non-experts, people who don't have the relevant expertise should, other things being equal, suspend judgment on that question. So anyway, I think Craig just got me totally wrong there.
Now, this attack on Christian apologists is also really ad hominem. Alexander Vilenkin is not a Christian apologist. Vilenkin is one of the world's most eminent cosmologists, a professor at Tufts University. And this is what he has to say. I'm going to quote from Vilenkin. "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning."
So one thing that I want to clarify here is that I was not trying to attack all Christian apologists. In the clip that they played, I started out by saying some defenders of the Kalam make this mistake, and I wish that apologists and the Kalam proponents would stop doing this mistake. I was not meaning to attack all apologists, and so my point there was specifically about some apologists and them making this mistake. And it's perfectly fine for me to lampoon some apologists who do in fact make this mistake, because there are ones who make it. Like Frank Turek is one who makes this, confidently trots out the Kalam and says that science establishes that, 13.8 billion years ago, the total entirety of spatiotemporal and physical reality began to exist 13.8 billion years ago, when that's simply not what science says. And I wish apologists like him would stop doing that. It's perfectly fine for me to say that. It's not like some illicit ad hominem. In any case, the use of ad hominem here is weird. I didn't infer from the fact that like infer from negative character traits to them being mistaken. Like, what? Like, I just said something negative about some apologist making a mistake, and I've committed an ad hominem. Like, I don't. Anyway.
Well, it's also another instance where the quote being read was one that we have responded to. I believe in the original video, Phil responded directly to this quote in particular. Yeah. And yet they didn't address addressing this quote.
Yeah, we explicitly responded to this quote.
So let's just nail it again. Firstly, Alex Vilenkin said this in a paperback book, right? It's not in the peer-reviewed paper. When challenged on it in his office, when I was in his office, he backtracked. He didn't say that. He said, no, it doesn't prove the universe had a beginning. So, yeah, when you write a paperback book, sometimes you make exaggerated claims. And this is a claim that I think he shouldn't have made. But when pressed in more recent times, he doesn't make that claim. But yet, Craig just ignores that. Right?
Well, also, one physicist. Wow. Now here you listed in our video like maybe a dozen right off the top of your head. You listed a dozen physicists who disagree with that, leading physicists and cosmologists who work on this question and specialize on it.
Right. So this is the very, very thing that we were criticizing him for, of cherry picking and saying, look, there are some cosmologists think the universe had a beginning, and there are some that don't. Right. And anyone that's followed this debate knows that Alan Guth thinks the universe doesn't have a beginning. Right. So what on earth is the validity of quoting one scientist and saying, we've got you? It doesn't work.
This is where I, at least in my view, some mischaracterization of the state of science comes in, because what impression are you clearly giving to your reader or your listener when you quote one scientist saying that the proof is in, no one can hide behind a beginningless past? You are giving the impression that in the state of science, this is an established question. This is settled among the relevant experts. If it weren't settled, then you shouldn't be presenting a quote like that. Or at least you should be clarifying that this is one person's view. There are lots of relevant experts who disagree with him on the very thing that I'm quoting him on. But no, Craig doesn't do that.
And also, we can play the same game. We can quote Vilenkin and disprove the Kalam, because Vilenkin says the universe doesn't need a cause, and quantum mechanics has showed that. Vilenkin also says that the multiverse can solve the fine-tuning problem. And of course there is a multiverse, right? And the universe did come from nothing. So we can play the quote Vilenkin game and get the exact opposite conclusion that you need, Craig.
About your work with James Sinclair in this podcast, are there any plans on more co-writing with Jim Sinclair or Luke Barnes?
No, but I do remain in consultation with both of them on these matters of cosmology, and they have been a tremendous help to me.
So, Bill, as we conclude today, what do you think about the accusation in Joe's podcast that you misuse science? And by the way, that's also the title of his podcast, William Lane Craig Misuses Science.
Yeah. If I'm guilty of misusing science, then the very same accusation must be made of Alexander Vilenkin, since I'm saying exactly the same thing that he says. But obviously, such an accusation lodged against an eminent cosmologist would be absurd.
Hey, it's Kevin Harris. So
Vilenkin does not stand by that quote. When I sat in his office and I asked him, does this theorem prove the universe had a beginning? He said, no, it doesn't. It only proves inflation had a beginning. So, yeah, I do think he said something wrong. And it's not absurd to say that an eminent cosmologist can say something wrong. Of course they can. I mean, that happens all the time. I mean, he makes accusations against Sean Carroll, against Stephen Hawking. I mean, against anyone, even against Alex Vilenkin, right? I mean, he says that Alex Vilenkin's got it wrong on the multiverse, on the universe from nothing, so why can't he get it wrong here? It's this total cherry-picking fallacy.
But also, it's just a straightforward false conditional that Craig just said, like that if Craig is misusing science, then Vilenkin is, like, let's even set aside all the criticisms that we've just brought up. A particular cosmologist, when they're making that first order claim in their discipline, like about what they take the state of the science to show, what they think the evidence supports, they can take sides on contentious issues. And in taking sides on contentious issues, they're not thereby like representing the state of the relevant literature on those issues. They're just taking a side and putting forward their position. But it's very different when someone else comes in and is trying to give their audience the impression every single beginningless model has been decisively ruled out, and cannot work and is physically untenable, and is only presenting one side of the relevant experts and is quoting that one side in support of the position that, these other views have been decisively ruled out, and is thereby giving the impression about the state of the science by quoting that first order scientist, that person can then be misrepresenting or mischaracterizing the state of science by doing that, even if the person being quoted is not. Again, this is just like the example that I gave in our video. I gave the example of Josh Rasmussen. Here I'll do it the example with Graham Oppy. Graham Oppy takes the view that God doesn't exist. And suppose Graham Oppy doesn't think this, but suppose Graham Oppy, he says the proof has now been in place. God doesn't exist, and people can no longer hide behind their belief in this fairy tale being or something. Suppose Oppy said that. That may very well be like Oppy's view about the success of a particular argument in the domain of philosophy, and it may very well be his first order view in philosophy that God doesn't exist. But if I'm giving a presentation trying to convince people that theism is rationally untenable, that the evidence in philosophy of religion just rules out theism, that it cannot be right, to quote Craig's own words, cannot be right with respect to any beginningless model. And I'm only quoting Oppy and not saying that people have responded to Oppy's book and people disagree about these sorts of things. And I'm thereby giving the impression that the state of philosophy of religion is such that this is a settled question in philosophy of religion. Then I can be misrepresenting the state of philosophy of religion, even if Graham Oppy himself is not. So again, even this conditional claim that Craig is making, I think, is just straightforwardly false.
One other technical point on quoting Vilenkin is that although Vilenkin does think the totality of existence has a beginning, he doesn't think our Big Bang is the beginning. And notice that when William Lane Craig is presenting the argument, he argues that our Big Bang is the evidence of the beginning. Vilenkin would absolutely disagree with that, right? Vilenkin thinks our Big Bang is one of many. So even that is not really appropriate.
Well, we've been through the whole podcast episode. Let's get any final concluding comments, maybe starting with Dan.
Yeah, I think we still really haven't heard a good response from Craig on the three most significant challenges I think that have been laid out. The one is that if space-time is classical, then they encounter the Mailman-Manchak theorem. They also encounter the problem that a singularity theorem is not going to be enough, that having a finite past, by Craig's own admission, does not entail having a beginning. Second, as far as the Big Bang is concerned, we have very good reason to think that as you look back through the universe's history, we encounter a regime near the Big Bang where the physics that we understand runs out. It's what George Ellis has called the physics horizon. It's the horizon of our physical knowledge, beyond which we don't know what sort of physics there might be. Of course, people think that this is the domain in which quantum gravity becomes important. There could even be physical theories beyond quantum gravity. We don't know what happens there. The third issue is this issue about probability, that it's just not going to be enough to say that, all of these individual models are improbable. What you have to actually show is that the disjunction of all of those models, along with the possibility that there's some unconceived alternative, that to say that that whole big disjunction, including the models we haven't thought of yet, that thing is improbable. And Craig just simply hasn't done that. He admits that that's exactly what one needs to do in the case of showing that the universe has a beginning, but that's not the methodology he employs when it comes to showing that the universe, when it comes to considering whether the universe is beginningless. And until he meets all of those challenges, he hasn't actually succeeded in defending the scientific case for the Kalam.
And Phil, any last words from you?
These are exactly the same talking points that he had 10 years ago, or maybe even 20 years ago. Things have moved on. We've presented a lot of new arguments, I think, against him and shown why some of the things he said, for example, in the Blackwell Companion, are wrong. And rather than reply to them, he just said, go back and read the Blackwell Companion. He repeated the same old talking points. He uses the same old tired quotes where we've shown that even the person making that quote doesn't stand by them anymore. But yet it's just a record on repeat. It's not interacting with what we've said. And this shows, I think, the very poor effort of this reply.
Yeah, and then I'll close with a few things. So I'm going to stand by the claim of misusing science. Again, not claiming intentionally misusing science, but I'm going to stick by the claim of misusing science all the way up until Craig responds to the point that, hey, he seems to be implying for his audience that this is a established science and it's settled among the relevant experts by means of his selective use of quotations, and until he addresses the various criticisms that we've been proffering with respect to his claim that the BGV theorem actually does show or support the beginning of the universe. I think both of those are misuses of science, and unless and until Craig addresses what we say with respect to them, I'm going to stick by that charge. I guess the final thing that I want to say is that, listen, we have been quite critical of Craig's work in this video and his response. But I do just want to emphasize that we actually do appreciate his work. He's done a lot of stuff in popularizing these arguments, in giving them robust philosophical and scientific defenses. He's really pushed the literature forward in developing the Kalam cosmological argument. He's made really interesting moves in these debates. He's really sharpened people's intellects and given them tools to think critically about these things. So I can at least speak for myself that Craig has brought a lot of value to these sorts of debates, and he is to be thanked and praised for that. So I thank Dr. Craig and praise him for bringing value to these sorts of debates. Now, of course, we disagree with the various conclusions that he draws, and we disagree with his reasons for giving them. And some of the reasons I don't even think are good reasons at all. Earlier on, we were criticizing them. I still do think it's valuable for him to be giving these views robust intellectual defenses and not stooping to the kind of poo-flinging levels of the new atheists that we were mentioning earlier. So I'll end with that positive note with respect to Craig, that despite being very critical, I still think we can be critical of his work and yet appreciative of his work. Thank you guys both for coming on. The audience, check out links in the description to Dr. Dan Linford's papers and his dissertation. Check out links to Phil's YouTube channel, as well as a link to pre-order his forthcoming book. And of course, if you made it this far, you probably see value in the work that I do. So please consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. Links to both of those are in the description. And of course, what better way to end is there than. I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason. And peace out.